Nigeria was granted independence on October 1, 1960. A new constitution established a federal system with an elected prime minister and a ceremonial head of state. The NCNC, now headed by Azikiwe, who had taken control after Macaulay's death in 1946, formed a coalition with Balewa's NPC after neither party won a majority in the 1959 elections. Balewa continued to serve as the prime minister, a position he had held since 1957, while Azikiwe took the largely ceremonial position of president of the Senate. On October 1, 1963, Nigeria became a republic. Azikiwe became president of the country, although as prime minister Balewa was still more powerful. After a brief honeymoon period, Nigeria's long-standing regional stresses, caused by ethnic competitiveness, educational inequality, and economic imbalance, again came to the fore in the controversial census of 1962-63. In an attempt to stave off ethnic conflict, the Midwest region was created in August 1963 by dividing the Western region. Despite this division, the country still was segmented into three large geographic regions, each of which was essentially controlled by an ethnic group: the West by the Yoruba, the East by the Igbo, and the North by the House of Fulani. Conflicts were endemic, as regional leaders protected their privileges. The South complained of Northern domination, and the North feared that the Southern elite was bent on capturing power. In the West, the government had fallen apart in 1962, and a boycott of the federal election of December 1964 brought the country to the brink of breakdown. The point of no return was reached in January 1966, when, after the collapse of order in the West following the fraudulent election of October 1965, a group of army officers attempted to overthrow the federal government, and Prime Minister Balewa and two of the regional premiers were murdered. A military administration was set up under Major General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi, but his plan to abolish the regions and impose a unitary government met with anti-Igbo riots in the north. The military intervention worsened the political situation, as the army itself split along ethnic lines, its officers clashed over power, and the instigators and leaders of the January coup were accused of favoring Igbo domination. In July 1966, northern officers staged a counter-coup. Aguiyi-Ironsi was assassinated. General Yakubu Gowon came to power. The crisis was compounded by intercommunal clashes in the north and threats of secession in the south. Gowon's attempt to hold a conference to settle the constitutional future of Nigeria was abandoned after a series of ethnic massacres in October. A last-ditch effort to save the country was made in January 1967, when the Eastern delegation, led by Lt. General Odumegwu Ojukwu, agreed to meet the others on neutral ground at Aburi, Ghana, but the situation deteriorated after differences developed over the interpretation of the accord. In May, the Eastern Region's Consultative Assembly authorized Ojukwu to establish a sovereign republic, while, at the same time, the federal military government promulgated a decree dividing the four regions into 12 states, including 6 in the north and 3 in the east, in an attempt to break the power of the regions. On May 30, 1967, Ojukwu declared the secession of the 3 states of the Eastern region under the name of the Republic of Biafra, which the federal government interpreted as an act of rebellion. Fighting broke out in early July and within weeks had escalated into a full-scale civil war. In August, Biafran troops crossed the Niger, seized Benin City, and were well on their way to Lagos before they were checked at Ore, a small town in Western State, now Ondo State. Shortly thereafter, federal troops entered Enugu, the provisional capital of Biafra, and penetrated the Igbo heartland. The next 2 years were marked by stiff resistance in the shrinking Biafran enclave and by heavy casualties among civilians as well as in both armies, all set within what threatened to be a military stalemate. Peacemaking attempts by the Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, remained ineffective, while Biafra began earning recognition from African states and securing aid from international organizations for what was by then a starving population. The final Biafran collapse began on December 24, 1969, when federal troops launched a massive effort at a time when Biafra was short on ammunition, its people were desperate for food, and its leaders controlled only 1/6 of the territory that had formed the Biafran Republic in 1967. Ojukwu fled to Côte d'Ivoire on January 11, 1970, and a Biafran deputation formally surrendered in Lagos 4 days later. General Gowon was able, through his own personal magnetism, to reconcile the two sides so that the former Biafran states were integrated into the country once again and were not blamed for the war. The oil boom that followed the war allowed the federal government to finance development programs and consolidate its power. In 1974, Gowon postponed until 1976 the target date for a return to civilian rule. but he was overthrown in July 1975 and fled to Great Britain. The new head of state, General Murtala Rahmat Muhammad, initiated many changes during his brief time in office. He began the process of moving the federal capital to Abuja, addressed the issue of government inefficiency, and, most important, initiated the process for a return to civilian rule. He was assassinated in February 1976 during an unsuccessful coup attempt, and his top aide, General Olusegun Obasanjo, became head of the government. Obasanjo pursued Muhammad's desire to return the country to civilian rule. As a first step, a new constitution was promulgated that replaced the British-style parliamentary system with a presidential one. The president was invested with greater power but could assume office only after winning 1/4 of the votes in 2/3 of the states in the federation. Many political parties emerged, but only 5 were registered: the National Party of Nigeria, NPN, the Unity Party of Nigeria, the People's Redemption Party, PRP, the Great Nigeria People's Party, and the Nigeria People's Party. All promised to improve education and social services, provide welfare, rebuild the economy and support private industry, and pursue a radical, anti-imperialist foreign policy. The PRP was notable for expressing socialist ideas and rhetoric. Shehu Shagari, the candidate of the dominant party, the right-wing NPN, narrowly won the 1979 presidential election, defeating Chief Obafemi Awolowo. The NPN's party leaders used political power as an opportunity to gain access to public treasuries and distribute privileges to their followers. Members of the public were angry, and many openly challenged the relevance of a democracy that could not produce leaders who would improve their lives and provide moral authority. Even in this climate, however, Shagari was re-elected president in August-September 1983, although his landslide victory was attributed to gross voting irregularities. Shagari was not able to manage the political crisis that followed or to end Nigeria's continuing economic decline, and the military seized the opportunity to stage a coup on December 31, 1983, that brought Major General Muhammad Buhari to power. Buhari justified his coup and subsequent actions by citing the troubles of the Second Republic and the declining economy. The regime declared a war against indiscipline, YE, which resulted in the arrest, detention, and jailing of a number of politicians. When the YE was extended to journalists and others not responsible for the social decay and economic problems, the government's popularity began to wane. General Ibrahim Babangida assumed power following a bloodless coup in August 1985. Babangida at first presented to the public and the media the image of an affectionate and considerate leader. He released political detainees and promised that public opinion would influence his decisions and those of the Armed Forces Ruling Council, the supreme governing body. The public, however, demanded an end to military rule. Babangida outwardly supported a return to civilian government but worked to undermine the process in order to retain power. A transition program was announced in 1986 that was to terminate in 1990, later extended to 1993, and the military controlled the process. The government created 2 political parties, the Social Democratic Party, SDP, and the National Republican Convention, NRC, and produced their agendas for them. Freely formed parties were not registered, and many politicians were banned from politics. The 1979 constitution was modified by a constituent assembly, and a series of elections were then held for local government councillors, state governors, and legislatures. Although Babangida voided presidential primary elections held in 1992, and all the candidates were banned from politics, a presidential election was slated for June 1993 between 2 pro-government candidates, Chief Mko Abiola of the SDP and Alhaji Bashir Tofa of the NRC. The Babangida government believed that the elections would never take place and felt that, even if they did, the north-south divide would lead to a stalemate, as Abiola came from the south and Tofa from the north. Contrary to government expectation, however, the election was held on schedule, and it was free, fair, and peaceful. Chief Abiola won, but Babangida annulled the results before they became official. This turned out to be a serious miscalculation that forced him out of power in August 1993, and an interim national government, ING, was instituted, led by Yoruba businessman Ernest Shonekan. The ING faced opposition from all sides, and Sani Abacha, the defense minister under Babangida, overthrew it in November, reinstating military rule. Like Babangida, he promised a transition to civilian rule while pursuing the means to maintain power, but, unlike Babangida, he used excessive force to attain his ambition. If the political future of Nigeria appeared bright with the victory of Chief Abiola in June 1993, Abacha's seizure of power and subsequent rule reversed most of the gains that the country had made since 1960. At no time since the mid-1960s did so many question the existence of Nigeria as a political entity. When leading politicians did not call for the breakup of the country, they advocated a confederacy with a weakened center and even a divided army and police force. Opposition forces called for a national conference to renegotiate the basis of Nigerian unity. The country's international image was damaged, as it suffered serious condemnation and isolation. The Abacha regime ignored due process of law, press freedom, individual liberty, and human rights. The government used violence as a weapon against its opponents and critics. When Abiola proclaimed himself president, he was arrested in June 1994 and died in jail in 1998. Trade union movements were suspended and protesters were killed, yet opposition to the government, particularly outside of the country, did not abate. Abacha and his loyalists again used the state as an instrument of personal gain. The decisive turning point in military disengagement came with Abacha's sudden death in June 1998. General Abdulsalam Abubakar, appointed to replace him, promised to transfer power to civilians. He freed political prisoners, ended the harassment of political opponents, and set forth a timetable for the transition to civilian rule. The country's international image improved, but economic performance remained sluggish. After Abacha's death, political activity blossomed as numerous parties were formed. If you are enjoying the content of this video, click the subscribe button so you can receive more content like this every week. Of these, 3 emerged that were able to contest elections: the People's Democratic Party, PDP, the Alliance for Democracy, and the All People's Party. A series of elections were held in January to March 1999 in which councillors for local governments, legislatures for state and federal assemblies, and state governors were selected. The presidential election took place in February and was carefully monitored by an international team of observers. Olusegun Obasanjo of the PDP, who as head of state in 1976 to 79 had overseen the last transition from military rule, was declared the winner. Obasanjo was sworn in on May 29, 1999. A new constitution was also promulgated that month. Nigerians, tired of prolonged and crisis-prone military regimes, welcomed the change of government, as did the international community. In the first civilian-administered elections since the country achieved independence in 1960, Obasanjo was re-elected in 2003, although there were widespread reports of voting irregularities. Although conditions in Nigeria were generally improved under Obasanjo, there was still considerable strife within the country. Ethnic conflict, previously kept in check during the periods of military rule, now erupted in various parts of Nigeria, and friction increased between Muslims and Christians when some of the northern and central states chose to adopt Islamic law, the Sharia. Demonstrations were held to protest the government's oil policies and high fuel prices. Residents of the Niger Delta also protested the operations of petroleum companies in their area, asserting that the companies exploited their land while not providing a reasonable share of the petroleum profits in return. Their protests evolved into coordinated militant action in 2006. Petroleum companies were targeted. Their employees were kidnapped, and refineries and pipelines were damaged as militants attempted to disrupt oil production and inflict economic loss. The movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta was the most active of such militant groups, although its activity decreased after the group declared a unilateral ceasefire, and the government introduced an amnesty program in 2009. Obasanjo was also faced with resolving an ongoing border dispute with neighboring Cameroon that included the question of which country had rights to the Bakassi Peninsula, an oil-rich area to which both countries had strong cultural ties. Under the terms of a 2002 International Court of Justice ruling, the region was awarded to Cameroon, and Obasanjo was criticized by the international community when Nigeria did not immediately comply by withdrawing its troops from the area in the subsequent years. He also received much domestic criticism for contemplating withdrawal from the peninsula by those who questioned the fate of the large number of Nigerians living in the region and cited the long-standing cultural ties between the Bakassi Peninsula and Nigeria. Nevertheless, Obasanjo eventually honored the terms of the ruling in 2006 when Nigeria relinquished its claim to the peninsula and withdrew its forces. The process of transferring the peninsula to Cameroon was not without its problems, including the ongoing issue of resettling Nigerians displaced by the transfer and the dissatisfaction of those who remained but were now under Cameroonian rule. In November 2007, Nigeria's Senate voted to void the agreement that had ceded the Bakassi Peninsula to Cameroon. However, this action did not affect the actual status of the peninsula, and a ceremony held on August 14, 2008, marked the completion of the peninsula's transfer from Nigeria to Cameroon. Meanwhile, Obasanjo was the subject of domestic and international criticism for his attempt to amend the constitution to allow him to stand for a third term as president. The proposed amendment was rejected by the Senate in 2006. With Obasanjo unable to contest the election, Umaru Musa Yar'Adua was selected to stand as the PDP's candidate in the April 2007 presidential poll. He was declared the winner, but international observers strongly condemned the election as being marred by voting irregularities and fraud. Yar'Adua's health was the subject of rumors, as he had traveled abroad for medical treatment several times in the years prior to his presidency and continued to do so after the election. His ability to serve as president while dealing with health issues was called into question after he went to Saudi Arabia in late November 2009 for treatment of heart problems and kidney problems. After he had been absent from Nigeria for several weeks, critics complained of a power vacuum in the country, and there were calls for Yar'Adua to formally transfer power to the vice president, Goodluck Jonathan. Although a ruling by a Nigerian court on January 29, 2010, indicated that Yar'Adua was not obligated to hand over power to the vice president while he was out of the country for medical treatment, the controversy surrounding his prolonged absence remained. On February 9, 2010, the National Assembly voted to have Jonathan assume full power and serve as acting president until Yar'Adua was able to resume his duties. Jonathan agreed and assumed power later that day, but it was unclear whether or not the assumption of power was constitutional. When Yar'Adua returned to Nigeria on February 24, 2010, it was announced that Jonathan would remain as acting president while Yar'Adua continued to recuperate. Yar'Adua never fully recovered, however, and he died on May 5, 2010. Jonathan was sworn in as president the following day. Jonathan's priorities for the rest of his term included tackling corruption, dealing with the country's energy problems, and continuing his involvement in peace negotiations with rebels in the Niger Delta, something he had focused on while he was vice president. Another area of focus cited by Jonathan was the reformation of the electoral process. Noting the irregularities associated with the 2007 presidential election, he vowed to make fair and transparent elections a priority, beginning with those scheduled for 2011. Voting in Nigeria's legislative elections began on April 2, 2011, but, because necessary electoral materials were not available in some areas, voting was halted and postponed until April 9, April 26 in some locations. As a result, the presidential election that was scheduled for April 9 was delayed until April 16. Jonathan was the overwhelming winner of the presidential election, receiving almost 59% of the vote among a field of 19 other challengers. Former military leader and head of state Muhammadu Buhari placed second, with about 32% of the vote. In other elections, the PDP did not fare as well as in previous years, but it managed to maintain control of the legislature and a majority of state governorship posts. Among the most pressing concerns in Jonathan's first full term as president was the ongoing threat presented by Boko Haram, an Islamic sectarian movement founded in 2002 in northeastern Nigeria. The group claimed to want to end the corruption and injustice in the country and impose Sharia, or Islamic law. Boko Haram did not gain widespread notoriety until 2009 when, after an altercation with military and local police forces, it began attacking police and government targets, killing and injuring many. In response, security forces launched a crackdown on the group, killing many members. Shortly thereafter, the group's leader, Muhammad Yusuf, was captured and killed while in police custody, as were several of his followers. After a hiatus, the group resurfaced under the leadership of Yusuf's deputy, Abubakar Shekau, and unleashed a campaign of violence in 2010 that continued in the following years. Boko Haram's attacks grew in intensity and frequency, occurring primarily in northeastern and central Nigeria and typically targeting government buildings, military barracks, the police, and Christian churches and schools. Extrajudicial violence and killings by the police and military while in the pursuit of the group's members were not uncommon and further heightened tensions in the country. The extrajudicial activity was also widely condemned by human rights groups. In 2012, some estimates held that more than 2,800 people had been killed by Boko Haram or by the security forces pursuing the group. The idea of granting amnesty to the group members if they disarmed had been periodically proposed but dismissed for various reasons. In April 2013, however, with Boko Haram's violence showing little sign of abatement and the previous strategies of dealing with the group by force clearly proven ineffective, Jonathan appointed a committee to investigate the implementation of an amnesty program, but it bore little fruit. Don't forget to like this video, if you are enjoying it. In June, Jonathan officially declared Boko Haram a terrorist group under Nigerian law. The militants and anyone caught helping them could then be prosecuted under the country's Terrorism Prevention Act, which was expected to facilitate legal prosecution of the accused. Boko Haram's attacks continued throughout the rest of 2013 and into 2014, with the government unable to do much to stop the group. In April 2014, Boko Haram's mass kidnapping of more than 275 girls from a boarding school in Chibok in Borno State brought the group and its unabated campaign of terror into the international spotlight. The kidnapping was widely condemned across the globe and generated an increase in offers of international assistance to Nigeria, which, unlike in the past, the country was now more willing to accept. Neighboring countries as well as Western nations worked with Nigeria to curtail the group's actions and to try to locate the missing schoolgirls. The next month, the UN Security Council imposed sanctions on individuals in Boko Haram, freezing assets and issuing travel bans and an arms embargo. But, given the nature of the group's operations, it was unclear if the sanctions would actually have an impact on Boko Haram's activities. They did not. The group's attacks continued, and in August Boko Haram declared the areas under its control to be an Islamic State. Although there were 14 candidates standing in the March 28, 2015, presidential election, the real contest was seen as being between Jonathan, once again the PDP candidate, and Buhari, the former military head of state, 1984-85, who was the All Progressives Congress, APC, candidate and enjoyed a reputation as being tough on corruption and adept at handling security issues. The election was the most closely contested ever in Nigeria. When it became clear that Buhari had won the election, Jonathan conceded. The election marked the first time that an incumbent had been defeated and power would be handed from one party to another. Buhari was inaugurated on May 29, 2015. Buhari faced several challenges as president. In 2016, declining oil revenue led to Nigeria's first recession in more than 25 years. Although some recovery progress was evident by 2018, many Nigerian citizens did not see relief, and the country earned the unenviable distinction that year of having the most people in extreme poverty in the world. Many questioned whether Buhari was fit enough to serve as president, as he repeatedly left the country for medical treatment of an undisclosed ailment. In 2017 he was absent for several months. There was progress in the fight against corruption, but it was accompanied by criticism that efforts were focused on members of the opposition while ignoring the corrupt activities of APC allies. Meanwhile, in early March 2015 Boko Haram pledged allegiance to the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, and took the name Islamic State, or States, West African Province, later more commonly known as Islamic State in West Africa. Other sources of insecurity were the ongoing clashes between herders and farmers in central Nigeria and unrest in the southeast stemming from the long-running issue of militants disrupting oil production as well as the resurgence of the Biafran secessionist movement. The latter group in 2017 observed the 50th anniversary of the region's Declaration of Independence. In the run-up to the February 2019 general elections, more than 70 candidates declared their intent to stand for president. Within that crowded field, the two leading candidates were Buhari, again the APC's candidate, and Atiku Abubakar, a seasoned politician who served as vice president under Obasanjo, representing the PDP. The election was originally scheduled for February 16, but, because of logistical problems, it was postponed just hours before it was due to begin and was held a week later, on February 23. Buhari was re-elected, taking 56% of the vote. Abubakar, his nearest challenger, won 41%. He was inaugurated for his second term on May 29, 2019. Since 2019, the economy and security of the country continues to decline and every change that came was only for the worse. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.